When I've asked students in my classes if anyone has sat them down and showed them how to take notes on a college textbook, they've all said no. So I made a video using 3 textbooks that I use in my classes to show you how to get the most out of your textbooks and the most into your brain. Intellectual property, torts and personal injury law, and criminal law and procedure. The reason I'm using 3 books is because they have a similar structure. And once you have down the structure of how to look at one of these textbooks, you can easily carry that over to others. So to start with, I'm going to take a look at our criminal law and procedure book. Now, here's the start of chapter 3, but whenever I'm reading a chapter, I never start at the beginning. Instead, I skip to the end. Each of these textbooks has questions for review at the end of the chapter. And these are valuable because these are the key points that the author wants you to get after having read it. So if you start by looking at the questions, it will tickle your memory when you see the answers to that in the text. For example, let's take a look at this set of questions. Number 2 is, what are the components of a crime? Define each. Well, I know that I'm going to be looking at the components of a crime and I'm going to remember to highlight them. The next is, explain how crimes are classified. What are the reasons for requiring actus reus in prosecuting crimes? Okay, I'm already getting a good idea. There's 26 questions here, so I'm not going to keep all of them at the top level of my memory, but I'm going to keep the repeated questions and the common terms. I see actus reus in several places in the forefront of my mind, so when I read the chapter, I'll look for those terms. The next book we're going to take a look at is the Torts and Personal Injury Law. And here we're going to take a look at chapter 2, Negligence and a Breach of Duty. Again, I'm not going to start with this chapter. I'm going to start at the end. I see the review questions here start with, what are the 4 basic elements of the tort of negligence? Number 2, in the context of duty, give an example of an affirmative act and a failure to act. So already I know I'm going to be looking at basic elements, I'm going to be looking at duty, and I already know that there's 2 types of duty, affirmative act and failure to act. So already I'm going to be looking for those things to distinguish the discussion of duty. Now I'm taking a look at the intellectual property textbook. I'm going to be looking at Chapter 17, Foundation of Patents Law, but again, I'm going to take a look at the questions first. And I see that the discussion questions include, classify each of the following as a utility, design, or plant patent. So before I've even started the chapter, I already know that there's 3 different types of patents, and I'm going to be looking at the distinguishing marks for each of them. Going on to the next page. Ben sees a new plant while walking in the mountain. Is the plant patentable? Discuss. Again, I'm going to be looking for the elements that makes a plant patentable. So by starting with the questions, it's going to get me into the right frame of mind to be reading the textbook. So the next thing we're going to do is start at the beginning of the chapter. Unfortunately, paralegal textbooks aren't like novels. You can't start them at the beginning, read them through once quickly, and expect to absorb all the materials. So what I do is read the textbook carefully, but I don't dawdle over it too much the first time. And I start by highlighting key terms that I see in the textbook that relate to those questions that I looked at, or just that I think are interesting. And sometimes I will help point out to myself what the key differences are and the key information, and sometimes I'll make a summary if that's what seems appropriate. And I'll show you now in the criminal law textbook what I do. Now this textbook, like the next one we're going to take a look at, has great stuff in the margins. Some of these textbooks are really helpful with things like key points and vocabulary words in the margin. So if I didn't know what prima facie case was, I'd probably highlight this. So then I go back to my highlighting, and you notice that the whole page is not highlighted, just key phrases. Because if you highlight the whole page, it's like nothing's highlighted at all. So I just want to hit things that are key to answer those questions or that I think are interesting. So if you remember, one of the questions for review was, what are the elements of negligence? And I found them here, so I'm highlighting them. and making myself a little note so I know what they are. Going on to the next page, you'll see more highlighting, and you see that I have highlighted a key area in the margin. The judge determines duty, question of law, and the jury determines breach, causation, and damages because they're questions of fact. And then some of your textbooks have sample cases in them, and if I think that the case is meaningful, I will make a short explanation of what the case is rather than highlighting it. So I think it's better for me and for you if you synthesize it rather than try to highlight the cases. And now we're back to the criminal law textbook, and you'll see that here I have highlighted the components of a crime, and if you remember the questions at the back of this chapter, one of them was, what are the components of a crime? So I've highlighted them here, and notice that down here I'm using two colors of highlighting. Use of highlighters is really optional. If you recall, for the IP textbook I didn't use highlighter at all. In the tort law I used one color, and in criminal law, because sometimes I want to distinguish classifications of what I'm covering, I used two colors. Harm, and the description of harm is in green here, and likely harm, but not actual harm, is highlighted with pink here. That's something that you can do. It's all up to you. You have to become familiar with taking notes in a textbook and see what works best for you. And feel free to take key points and make your writing bigger. Feel free to summarize in the margin, highlight, make little brackets, underline. If you have a question about something, put a question mark after it. Make the text your own. Now, I do realize that some of you are using electronic texts, but most of them have markup tools that you can use, so if so, use them. If you are stuck with a copy of the book that you can't mark up, say you're borrowing a friend's copy, then you just have to take better written notes. So now we're going to cover what goes into written notes. I've showed you what goes into marking up a textbook. That's only the first stage. After I've read a chapter through with relative promptness and highlighted key terms, I go back and I read it thoroughly, and this time I make my own handwritten notes. And I'm going to excerpt a little example of a more detailed discussion I did in my intellectual property course on how I took the questions, took the information in the textbook, and brought it into my own set of notes. So I've read the questions in the back of the chapter, so I know what I should be looking for. I've read the chapter through once, and I've annotated it. Now remember, marking up the textbook is helpful, but it's annotation, it's not notes. The purpose of notes is to help you get the information and retain it in your brain. And studies have shown that actually sitting down and taking handwritten notes helps the process of consolidating those memories and making them permanent. So yes, I'm showing you my crummy handwriting because if I really want to remember something, I'll write it down. I do realize that many of you prefer to take notes in a typed format. That's fine, as long as you remember that you're not just copying what's in the textbook. You're synthesizing, you're rephrasing, you're summarizing. Just copying what's in the textbook is of limited value. If you think about it, you can't summarize something unless you understand it. And so by thinking about it and coming up with the shorter, more succinct paraphrases and summaries, that will help you really make sure you understand what you're talking about. So here's a sample of what my desk looks like when I'm getting going. You see I've got the annotated text there, I've got my notepad. I frequently flip back and forth between the notes to make sure that I've gotten all the information, because sometimes the way I like to summarize it means I will take things that the author has in a couple of different places in the chapter and bring it into one section. So feel free to take notes the way that makes sense for you, but make sure you're doing it in a very active way. I think you can tell that I've really worked hard to take the notes for this chapter and get all the information that I want to get out of it. I mean, you're paying a lot of money for your education and your textbook. You should want to get out the most that you can. Don't be afraid to make your notes look messy. I like to draw arrows. I like to have little summaries. I have some things that are important all in capital letters. Make the notes work for you. Sometimes the best way to summarize your information is to make charts. So this is actually the last page in the notes I was just showing you. At the top, I'm comparing the different types of patents, utility, plant, and design, where they have similar elements and where they differ. And on the bottom, I have the timeline for the 3 different types of patents. Don't be afraid to give yourself a chart or a visual to help you memorize. The last thing I do after I've finished taking my notes is to go back to the same chapter questions I started with to see if this time I can answer them. And if I can't, then I need to go back, find where the answer is in the chapter, and add it to my notes. So here's your 4-part system on how to get the most out of your textbook by reading it carefully and taking notes that summarize the content and help you retain the information. Again, this is a lot of work, but isn't your education worth it? The more you master and remember from your classes, the better you'll do when you're in your first job at a real law office. Good luck.